Hardin Crossing, Wyoming Territory, 1881. The town sat at the junction of two wagon roads that crossed in a wide, flat valley where the mountains pulled back far enough to let the sky feel generous. By autumn of that year, the dry goods store called Mace & Sons had been operating for 11 years under a sign that nobody had thought to update when the last son of the Mace family moved to Denver. And nobody had thought to update again when Henry Mace, 34 years old, and the store's sole proprietor, rode out one September morning to check the freight route through Galloway Pass and didn't come home. The store was Rowena Mace's now. She was 27 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of quiet efficiency that tends to develop in people who've been doing things themselves long enough that asking for help no longer occurs to them as an option. She had learned the store's inventory system in the weeks after Henry's funeral simply because someone had to, and she had renegotiated the wholesale accounts herself in the month that followed, and she had held the thing together through winter on sheer determination and the steady patience of a woman who'd grown up on a homestead in Kansas where there was no such thing as not managing. Ambrose Quill had started stopping by the store on a Tuesday in early March, 5 months after he'd arrived in Hardin Crossing with a modest savings and a reputation. Quietly earned, never advertised, as a man who could repair anything with wheels. He was 52 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd worked with his hands for a long time, with gray coming heavy through his dark hair, and the kind of eyes that moved across a room the way a former lawman's eyes always do, cataloging exits and expressions without appearing to be doing either. He'd bought coffee beans that first morning, axle grease the second, a length of rope the third. By the fourth Tuesday, Rowena had set the coffee beans on the counter before he made it through the door. "Figured I'd save us both the pretense," she said, not looking up from the ledger she was working through. Ambrose Quill had considered that for a moment. "Appreciate the efficiency," he said, and set his coins on the counter. And that had been the beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet. He'd heard the broad outline of her circumstances, the way newcomers always heard things in small towns. Sideways, through other conversations, in the gaps between what people said directly and what they were actually talking about. Henry Mace had been well-liked. His death, ruled accidental by the county coroner, who'd made the long ride from the county seat, had genuinely grieved the town. What the town had grieved somewhat less publicly was what followed. Orville Mace, 48 years old, Henry's older brother by 14 years, had arrived from Cheyenne within 3 weeks of the funeral, carrying a document he'd had drawn up by a lawyer Rowena had never heard of, citing a debt agreement their father had signed before the store was built. An agreement Orville claimed gave him prior claim to the property in the event Henry died without a male heir to inherit directly. The territorial court, unwilling to make a fast ruling on contested frontier property claims, had frozen the dispute pending review, which meant Rowena was running a store she wasn't certain she still legally owned, watching every dollar in the till with the knowledge that Orville might eventually walk out of a courtroom and simply take it from her. She'd told the sheriff about it when it first happened. The sheriff had been sympathetic and useful, in exactly the way that told her he was neither. Ambrose had not been told these things directly by Rowena. At 27 and 52, with her just keeping the store running and him newly established in a town where he was still a stranger, they hadn't yet reached the kind of conversations where a woman told a man about her legal troubles. What they'd reached was coffee on the counter before he walked in, and occasionally a dry observation about the weather, and once, on a morning when she'd had a particularly difficult letter from Orville's lawyer, a silence between them that had been comfortable enough that neither of them felt the need to fill it. That had felt like something, too. He understood her circumstances through the particular kind of attention he'd spent 30 years cultivating. The attention of a man trained to notice what evidence said, rather than what a story presented. He'd noticed the way her shoulders held tension on mornings a letter arrived in the post. He'd noticed the worn-down heels on her work boots that told him she hadn't allowed herself the expense of replacing them. He'd noticed that the sign above the door still said Mace & Sons, and that she hadn't changed it. And he'd thought about that one longer than the other details, because it seemed to say something precise about a woman who was holding the shape of a life someone else had built and trying to fill it honestly. He'd started finding small ways to be useful without making them look like charity. A wheel on the supply wagon, she used for town deliveries, had been wearing unevenly. He'd mentioned it in passing one morning, the way a man might mention a loose button, and had the thing rebalanced before she had time to decide whether to be grateful or insulted. A loose board on the store's front step that he'd fixed on a Wednesday morning before she opened, leaving no indication he'd done it at all, except that it no longer creaked underfoot. A crate of goods she'd been struggling to shift to the back storeroom on an afternoon when she'd assumed she was alone. He'd simply appeared beside her and moved it without comment, and then gone back to looking at the nails display as though he'd only come in for nails. "You're going to need to stop doing that," Rowena told him one morning, the coffee already on the counter, her arms folded in front of her in a way that was more exasperated than angry. "Stop doing what?" Ambrose said, entirely without guile. "Being useful," she said, without being asked. "It makes it harder to be appropriately distant with you." He was 52 years old, and he'd spent enough of those years learning to read people that he could tell the difference between a woman who was genuinely asking him to stop and a woman who was giving him an honest accounting of her own defenses. "That's a fair warning," he said, and set his coins on the counter and didn't entirely stop. It was Rowena herself who opened the door to what she hadn't let herself look at in 8 months. She mentioned it the way a person's mentions something they've been carrying so long it started to feel like furniture. In passing, without quite meeting his eyes, on a morning 3 weeks after what Ambrose had started privately calling their first real conversation. "Henry left for Galloway Pass at 6:30 in the morning," she said, stacking bolts of fabric on a shelf. "Gordon Priest, the freight driver who ran the same route, said he saw Henry ride out. Said Henry told him he expected to be back by noon." Ambrose waited. "They found him at sundown," Rowena said, 4 hours after noon, at the base of the pass, his horse wandering loose in the road below. She set down the last bolt of fabric and turned to face him. "A man who plans to be home by noon doesn't spend 6 extra hours at a mountain pass," she said, "even accounting for a bad fall, even accounting for a spooked horse. The timing never sat right with me. I asked the sheriff about it once, early on. He said horses run a long way when they're frightened. A horse running from a fall at Galloway Pass would run back toward town," Ambrose said, because he'd covered enough hard country in his years as a lawman to know which direction a frightened animal would go. Not down the mountain road in the direction of home, at a pace slow enough to be found wandering at a standstill. Rowena looked at him directly. "Yes," she said, "that's what I thought too." I want to pause here for just a moment. Before we go further into what Ambrose Quill found when he started asking the questions, Rowena Mace had been too exhausted to ask herself. Stories like this one travel farther than I ever expect when I sit down to tell them. And I find myself wondering every time where you are tonight while you're listening. Whether you're somewhere quiet, or somewhere noisy, or somewhere in between. Whether this story found you because you needed a little company in a difficult hour, or whether it simply found you the way good stories sometimes do, without much explanation needed. If you're with us right now, if this kind of storytelling has given you something worth keeping tonight, I'd love to know where you are. Leave a comment. Tell me your city, your state, your country, and let me know you're out there. And if Prairie Hearts is the kind of company you'd like to keep, a like helps the next person who needs it find their way here too. Thank you for being with us tonight. Now, back to Hardin Crossing, Wyoming Territory, and to what a 52-year-old man with a lawman's instincts had begun to quietly understand about the morning Henry Mace rode out and didn't come home. He found Gordon Priest at the freight yard on the edge of town, a weathered man of 38 who had the look of someone who'd been carrying an uneasy thought long enough that it had settled permanently into the lines of his face. Gordon was not hard to find. He was considerably more forthcoming than Ambrose had expected. "I told the sheriff at the time," Gordon said, the two of them standing in the shade of a wagon shed with the afternoon light going long across the yard. "Said, I saw a man follow Henry out of town that morning, maybe 10 minutes behind him, riding a gray horse. I didn't know the man well enough to put a name to him straight away, but I knew the horse. It was from the Mace family's own stock. Orville Mace used to ride that gray when he came through town to meet with Henry on business." Ambrose said nothing, the way a man says nothing when he knows the next sentence matters. "Sheriff said I'd probably mistaken the timing," Gordon continued. "Said it was early, and I'd maybe seen Orville ride out later in the day, not right behind Henry. But I know what I saw, and I know the difference between 10 minutes and 2 hours." He looked down at his hands. "I kept quiet after that because the ruling was already made, and Orville Mace had been standing right there beside the sheriff when he made it." Ambrose rode back toward town that afternoon, with the mountain light going gold across the valley, thinking about a gray horse and a 10-minute gap, and a woman who was 27 years old and had been carrying the weight of a doubt she was too tired to examine. He had one more thing to find before he brought any of it to her: the saddlebag. He'd learned about it from a detail in the coroner's notes, a dry reference to personal effects recovered at the scene. The bag had been returned to Rowena, and she'd put it in the back storeroom without opening it, because she hadn't been able to make herself open it, and in 8 months of hard days, she still hadn't found the hour when she could. She let him look through it without asking why he was asking. He thought that said something about the kind of trust that had quietly accumulated between them, the kind that doesn't announce itself with any ceremony. The letter was folded twice at the bottom of the bag, underneath a spare pair of gloves. Henry Mace had been writing to the territorial marshal's office. The letter was dated 2 weeks before his death. In it, Henry described, in the careful language of a man who'd been a meticulous bookkeeper all his working life, how he'd discovered that Orville Mace had been submitting fraudulent insurance claims on freight shipments for the past 3 years. Using Henry's own account numbers, his own good standing with the insurance company, to collect on losses that had never actually occurred. Henry had calculated the total at nearly $4,000. He had been preparing to send the letter on the morning he rode toward Galloway Pass. He had told no one, except Ambrose understood now he hadn't needed to. A man committing $4,000 worth of fraud doesn't need to be told when the one person capable of exposing him has figured it out. He only needs to be watching carefully enough. Orville Mace had been watching carefully enough. Ambrose told Rowena that same evening, sitting in the back room of the store after she'd locked the front door for the night, a lamp burning low between them on the work table where she did her accounts. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. "He was writing to the marshal," she said at last. Not a question. Her hands were flat against the work table, and she was looking at the letter the way a person looks at something that confirms a truth they'd hoped was wrong. He'd found out what Orville was doing with his accounts, Ambrose said, and he was going to stop it, and Orville knew. Rowena was quiet again. Outside, the wind moved through Hardin Crossing's empty main street. "I've spent 8 months," she said, her voice gone low and very steady, "building my life around the idea that Henry died because a horse shied on a mountain trail at the wrong moment. That it was simply the kind of terrible thing that happens to good people without reason or warning. That there was nothing to understand and nothing to be angry at except bad luck." She pressed her fingers briefly against her closed eyes. "I don't know how to sit with this," she said, "that it wasn't bad luck at all." "You don't have to know how to sit with it tonight," Ambrose said. He was 52 years old, and he'd delivered hard truths before, and he'd learned that the only honest thing a person can offer in that moment is presence and patience, not solutions. "But I thought you deserved to know that your instinct was right, that the timing was wrong, that you weren't imagining a reason to doubt the story everyone else accepted, because accepting it was easier." Rowena sat with that a long time in the lamplight. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "You were a lawman before you came here," she said. "Not a question." "For 23 years, Ambrose said. Left it 3 years back." "Why?" He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. He was 52 years old, and he'd told almost no one in Hardin Crossing anything about the years before. Not because he was hiding something shameful, but because some things simply hadn't had a listener he trusted enough yet. "Made a call wrong in the field," he said. "Man died who shouldn't have. I had the training, I had the authority, and I still got it wrong. Spent the following year convinced I was no longer the kind of man who should be making any calls at all. Drifted west. Fixed wagons." He allowed himself the smallest shift in expression. "Found I could be decent enough at that without anyone dying because of it." Rowena looked at him across the table in the low lamplight. She was 27 years old, and she had been managing entirely on her own for the better part of a year, and she had grown very careful about what she allowed herself to trust. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. "Seemed only fair," Ambrose said, "given everything you've had to hand over to me this evening." They sat together in the back room a good while longer, the lamp burning down between them. Neither of them in a hurry to end it. They brought what they had to Sheriff Aldous Burke the following week. Gordon Priest's account of the gray horse and the 10-minute gap, the unfinished letter to the territorial marshal, and Ambrose's methodical reconstruction of the afternoon's timeline, showing that Henry could not have been found when he was, if he'd fallen when the coroner's estimate supposed. The sheriff's expression shifted from polite skepticism to something considerably more uncomfortable as the pieces arranged themselves in front of him. "I closed that case on the word of the family member who was present at the scene," Burke admitted, looking at the letter. "That's not the same thing as investigating it properly. I see the distinction now." He looked at Rowena directly. "I owe you a better answer than the one I gave you 8 months ago," he said. "I intend to provide one." Orville Mace was brought in for questioning 2 days later. He held together through the first hour with the rigid confidence of a man who'd spent months constructing a story and believed in the architecture of it. Then the sheriff showed him the letter, and the architectural confidence began, slowly, to give way. "I didn't mean for him to go off the trail," Orville said. Finally, in the small back office of the sheriff's building, his voice stripped down to something barely recognizable as the voice of the man who'd spent 8 months pressuring Rowena to sign away what was hers. "I only meant to take the letter, to stop him from sending it. I thought if I could just get the letter, I could fix the rest somehow. I didn't account for." He stopped, said nothing further. Rowena, standing in the doorway with Ambrose beside her, found herself feeling something she hadn't expected to feel at the end of 8 months of doubt and survival. Not triumph, not quite relief, something quieter and stranger than either. The feeling of a question finally settling into an answer, even when the answer was as hard and sorrowful as this one was. She wept that night for the first time since Henry's funeral. Properly wept, sitting on the back step of the store with the stars going thick and bright over Hardin Crossing and the mountains a dark shape against the winter sky. Ambrose sat beside her and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. "I couldn't grieve him honestly before," she said, when the worst of it had passed. "I was too angry at the uncertainty. At not knowing whether what I was grieving was the truth or just the version the coroner's report had handed me. I needed the actual shape of it before I could sit inside it properly." "Grief needs something solid to lean against," Ambrose said. "Hard to do that work when the ground under it keeps shifting." Rowena looked at him in the dark. He was 52 years old, 25 years older than she was, a man who drifted quietly into her town and her mornings and her trust, so gradually she'd barely noticed it happening until it was already complete. "You gave me the solid ground," she said. "I want you to know I understand exactly what it cost you to go looking for the truth when you didn't have to." "Wasn't a cost," Ambrose said. "Was a choice. There's a difference." The territorial court dismissed Orville Mace's property claim within a month of his arrest, the fraudulent debt agreement he'd had drawn up collapsing entirely under the weight of his own criminal conviction. The store was Rowena's without contest or condition. The insurance company, compelled by the territorial marshal's subsequent investigation, recovered the stolen funds and paid a settlement into an account in Henry Mace's name that passed to Rowena by court order. She found herself that winter not wealthy exactly, but stable in a way she hadn't been since the morning Henry rode out and didn't come home. She also found herself noticing, for the first time, that the coffee on the counter before Ambrose walked in each morning was no longer something she did from simple habit. She was watching for him. She had been watching for him longer than she'd been willing to admit to herself. Ambrose, for his part, had spent 3 weeks after the court ruling keeping a careful distance, not from indifference, but from the particular scruple of a 52-year-old man who'd watched a 27-year-old woman's circumstances change considerably and wasn't certain, from the outside, how much of what he felt for her would look, to anyone watching, like a man drawn to what she'd won rather than to the person who'd earned it. Rowena noticed the distance. She let it sit for 2 weeks. Then, on a Tuesday morning with the coffee already on the counter and frost on the window pane, she said, "You've been stopping by and leaving faster than you used to." Ambrose, who had indeed been doing exactly that, said nothing. "I'm going to say something plain," Rowena said, "because I've spent the last year with no patience left for people who can't say things plainly." She looked at him directly. "I am 27 years old. You are 52. I have no family nearby and no interest in a situation where those facts would matter in any way that changes what I'm about to tell you." Ambrose waited. "I trust you," Rowena said. "That is not a small thing for me to say, and I want you to understand I know exactly what it means, and I'm saying it deliberately. Whatever the rest of it looks like, that part is real, and I'd rather you stopped keeping your distance and let me decide for myself what I want to do about it." He asked her properly 2 weeks later, at the front counter of the store, at the same hour of the same morning. He'd first walked in asking for coffee beans. The frost outside, replaced now by a thin January sunshine that did its honest best against the cold. "You've run this place for a year on your own," he said. "I'm not here to change that. You're better at the accounts than I'll ever be, and I know enough to know it." He looked at her steadily. "What I am proposing is that, whatever the next years look like, you don't have to spend them wondering whether the person walking through that door in the morning is actually on your side. I'm 52 years old, and I know what I want with the clarity that only comes from having spent a long time without it. I'd like to spend whatever years I've got left making myself useful to a woman who knows exactly who she is." Rowena Mace 27 years old, looked at Ambrose Quill, 52 years old, across the worn wooden counter of a store that was hers now, properly and entirely hers, and said, "Yes, on the condition that you stop fixing things without telling me first. We fix things together, or you ask." "That's a fair condition," Ambrose said. "It's the only condition," Rowena said, and allowed herself the kind of smile that had been in short supply for the better part of a year. They married in the spring, in the church with the bell that actually rang on Sundays. The whole town turned out, as small towns always do for events that feel like the right ending to a hard story. Rowena kept the sign above the door. She had it repainted that summer, same lettering, same position, but she asked the painter to add a second line beneath it, smaller, that read simply, Est, 1870. Still standing. Gordon Priest, 38 years old, gave testimony in Orville's fraud trial that put the conviction beyond any reasonable doubt, and found himself afterward with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who'd finally said the true thing to the people with authority to act on it. He stayed on the Hardin Crossing freight route for another decade. He told people who asked that he'd always known what he'd seen that September morning. He'd just needed someone to ask him a second time. Sheriff Aldous Burke, humbled by how close he'd come to letting an injustice stand, because it was tidier than the alternative, spent the following years advocating publicly for a territorial standard, requiring independent review of any death involving active property disputes. He cited Hardin Crossing by name every time he made the argument. He didn't consider it a comfortable legacy, but he considered it an honest one. Ambrose Quill, who was 52 years old when they married, was still fixing things without being asked well into his 60s, which Rowena had fully anticipated. And she was still raising an eyebrow at him for it, which he had fully anticipated, and neither of them found the arrangement difficult to live with. I have been telling stories like this one for longer than I can easily account for. And the thing that still surprises me, every single time, is how far a simple story about a woman standing her ground and a patient man making himself useful can travel. How many people, in how many different kinds of difficult years, find something in it that belongs to them? Rowena Mace was 27 years old and already knew something important. That the truth, even when it's hard to face, is always worth pursuing, because you cannot build anything solid on ground you haven't actually examined. And Ambrose Quill, at 52, carried the particular wisdom that only comes from a long life of making mistakes honestly. The wisdom to know that patience is not weakness, and that steady, quiet presence is sometimes the most powerful thing one person can offer another. There is a rare kind of courage in a woman who keeps asking the question she's afraid of the answer to. And there is a rare kind of decency in a man who helps carry the weight of that asking without trying to take the question away from her. Thank you for spending this evening with us in Hardin Crossing. Wherever you are tonight, whatever room, whatever corner of this wide world. I hope you found some quiet company here and some small reminder that honesty and patience are still worth something, and that it is never too late to build something good from whatever ground you're standing on. May God bless you and keep you. Until the next story finds you, keep writing.